morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Doug Berkey, Executive Director of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Welcome to today's Aerospace Nation series. And we're pleased that Lt Col Jake Sotiriadis and members of his Global Futures Report team could join us. Jake is currently serving as the Chief of AFWIC's Strategic Foresight and Futures Branch at Headquarters Air Force. He is an intelligence officer by training and holds a Ph.D. in political science and geopolitical futures from the University of Hawaii. Joining him are Kara Kunzman, a political analyst and lead for strategic foresight at the Center for Space Policy at the Aerospace Corporation. Jason Schenker, chairman of the Futurist Institute. Vera Zakim, senior technology and policy advisor at the Institute for Security and Technology. And Shannon McGurk of AFWIC. I just want to thank you all for joining us here today. And Jake, I'd like to kick things off by giving you an opportunity to make a few opening remarks regarding AFWIC's Global Futures Report. Could you please help us better understand the motivating factors behind the effort? And what is strategic foresight, and how can it be applied to national security?
Good morning, Doug, and I want to thank you, the Mitchell Institute, and of course, Lieutenant General Deptula for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. And we're so thankful for the great partnership that Mitchell Institute has with all the efforts that we're working. And this opportunity to talk about it is much appreciated.
The honors are ours.
And I think if we're going to talk about strategic foresight and the importance of strategic foresight to national security and building national security futures, we really need to go no further than where we are today in the midst of this present disruption. And while today is certainly a challenging time for us, it's also an exciting time in terms of strategic foresight, because I'm really of the opinion that we are truly living a renaissance of strategic foresight today, and that the disruption wrought by this pandemic is actually raising the premium on the demand signal for future studies and strategic foresight. And I think it's a testament to the Air Force and AFWIC's efforts to innovate and to look at new ways of thinking to really come out on top in the cognitive domain that brings us here today. And so a year ago, the strategic foresight branch of AFWIC actually didn't exist. This is a relatively new effort. And for your audience, I'm sure most of whom are familiar with AFWIC, but the Air Force warfighting integration capability really has the institutional lead at the Air Force for future force design and looking at not only the requirements, but all the external components that go into that. And I think strategic foresight, if I can define that up front, really, it's anticipatory thinking that can lead to better decision making. That's what we're trying to get at in a nutshell. And we are not actually predicting the future here. And so I want to put that out there upfront so that our audience understands. When we talk about strategic foresight or future studies or futures analytics, which is the academic discipline of what we're doing, this is actually looking at sources of disruption and then actually going out and harnessing weak signals that are in the current environment today and emerging trends, harnessing all of that data together, putting it together and then overlaying that over your current organization's mission set or strategic planning efforts. And what that allows you to do is actually expand the range of options, and we call that the foresight zone, to build out alternative futures of things that might happen, turning up the volume on those weak signals, which then give you a wide range of options so that you can essentially future-proof your strategic planning. And when you can understand the historical causes of not only societal change, but technological change, military change, it really postures your organization to be able to weather any sort of disruption and forge ahead. And now we got to state up front as well that we'll never be able to solve for uncertainty, right? That's always going to be an element of the national security environment and frankly, even the business environment. But what we can do is we can apply a very disciplined methodology to the process of strategic planning that allows us to put all of those elements together. And what I like to liken this to, Doug, is really this idea that we need to adopt what I call landscape thinking. And if we think about a landscape portrait that hangs on the wall, it's not only the colors that make up the landscape, but it's also the shape of the painting. It's also the texture. It's also all of those things that are on there. It's all of the details that make up that one item that is a landscape. And if we think of a security landscape, thinking about defense and national security futures as a security landscape, in our case, that means that we can't just sit and think about air power. We need to think about a whole range of options across what we call the STEEP framework, scientific issues, technical issues, economic issues, environmental issues, and political issues. All of those have touch points that come back and affect the Air Force's core mission. And ultimately, it's our job to see through some of those blind spots and allow us to develop this anticipatory thinking that can go towards future strategic planning.
No, thanks for that great overview. Let's dig a little bit deeper into this effort. Now, the report outlines several potential options that could play out in the strategic environment over the next several years. Many might find these projections to be a bit far-fetched or overly negative, yet, as you explained, I think it's important to emphasize that these scenarios are not supposed to be taken literally. They're thought exercises meant to challenge assumptions and promote insightful thinking. It's also worth pointing out that as COVID-19 has demonstrated, there are times when the seemingly impossible does occur, placing an extremely high value on preparation. So given all that, how did your effort differ from past strategic planning exercises?
Well, Doug, let me just say up front, if you and I had been having this conversation back in January of 2020, after we had all had our New Year's champagne and we're toasting the new year, we'd be talking about something different. We'd be talking about what a lot of news agencies at the time were mentioning, which was the potential for World War III based off of events in the Middle East. And as we see, 2020 took an entirely different direction, right?
Yeah.
The idea, though, is being able to understand the source of disruption and where do you go from that disruption. Is it a continuation of basically current trends and dynamics, or is it truly a seismic shift and change with the scope and magnitude to actually affect what we would call a scenario shift towards a different direction? And as we saw in January, that wasn't the case, but obviously the pandemic was. So where I'm going to use some slides here just to share the screen and help the audience understand a little bit more of how we were able to put this effort together, and then also the differentiation of strategic foresight through or vis-a-vis some other disciplines, just like intelligence. So sure. I just want to just confirm that we can see the slides here.
Yep, they look good.
So like I mentioned before, this is really anticipatory thinking to support decision-making and ultimately make better decisions. But to your question directly, Doug, if we just take the present and we look at what we would look at as economic trend analysis or even political trend analysis, that really tells us what to expect if nothing changes, if everything stays the same. So along a present trajectory, you can use trend analysis. Now, I'm an intelligence officer by trade, and I've worked in not only Air Force intelligence, but the national intelligence community. And intelligence assessments traditionally give us likely adversary courses of action, but again, based on established patterns of behavior. How have we seen either pattern of life? How have we seen strategic operations take place? How have we seen established patterns of behavior? Well, they give us a most likely and least likely course of action, again, in general terms. Strategic foresight forces us to really push our intellectual horizons a bit further. And what it really forces us to do is embrace complexity in thinking. And when I say complexity, I don't mean something is complicated. I mean that something actually has multi-causality, multi-source causality. It's a non-linear process. And so we have codependent variables that often come together and give us a different outcome than we expected. And so that's why it's so important to understand how we can harness weak signals and emerging trends to build that map, to build a tangible map of the disruption. And this is really the rationale for how we built the report. So what we do is, this is a model that actually has been around for a while in industry. And I think the most probably well-known and widely known example was Royal Dutch Shell in the late 60s and early 70s, which harnessed scenario development to be able to weather the oil crisis, energy crisis of that time period. But if we look at questions that industry might ask today of strategic foresight, how could a UPS today leverage blockchains to try to compete with Amazon over the next 5 years? The thing is, in the national security environment, in the public sector in particular, we tend to live in an environment where we're rewarded with victory through a short-term budget cycle. And so what that does is it almost puts an institutional challenge to really looking at a 15 or 20-year strategic look. And if we can think that cutting-edge companies in the private sector that are a lot more flat organizationally struggle with doing this, when you layer a hierarchical chain of command on top of it in bureaucracy, it of course makes it even that much more challenging when we talk about these kinds of issues, which I think is a testament to the Air Force's success, not only in standing up this branch less than a year ago, implementing strategic foresight as part of the operational processes that AFWIC has today, and then also putting out this global futures report in the midst of the disruption that's around, and harnessing our global network of foresight practitioners and experts who wanted to partner with us. This is actually an example of the service reaching out as the leader and attracting industry and attracting academics as well to come in and partner with us to put out this report. We're really excited about it.
That's really great. So having executed this study, what are some of the top assumptions resident in current defense thinking that you think would benefit from reassessment? And how has COVID-19 informed your thinking in this regard?
Well, I think what we really need to look at, Doug, here, and we already faced, before the pandemic happened, we already faced this very, very complex security environment that was marked by technological change. We already have our charter and our course basically laid out in the National Defense Strategy. When you overlay, though, this major international disruption of the pandemic, it really raises the premium on a different way of thinking, on a paradigm shift, if you will, in terms of how we visualize national security futures. And so some of the top issues that I would mention are actually reflected here on this slide, and it's actually, they make up the basis for the report. And how we went about this was, nobody instructed us to do this. We decided that we needed to address the disruption in a more disciplined way, not necessarily to make, because the initial inclination for everybody when the pandemic hits, of course, is which programs are we going to cut, or which programs are we going to reinvest in, right? How are we going to shift the money around? And those are very valid questions and very important questions. But before we can do that, we really need to take a disciplined way, methodological way of looking at how disruption happens, and then what the touch points are for the Air Force and for the Department of Defense. And so we took basically a functional and a geopolitical look at this. And we've got issues like geopolitical competition in space, autonomous systems, national security supply chains. We looked at malign influence campaigns, but also geopolitics from a much different perspective. Things like new fault lines in the Middle East, and also some new implications for transatlantic relations. And so I would say that the real value of the report and what it does, I think, for the leadership in the department, is that it allows them really to take a different look at how we envision national security futures, and underscores the fact that this kind of disruptive thinking really represents innovation in thought, not necessarily in programmatics. And it allows us to basically use this report as a way to basically examine how our current strategic plans hold up against a wide range of scenarios. And we've actually had our allies and partners reaching out to us, asking for this report, and we've even heard that they're wargaming scenarios based off of what we've developed here in this report. So we're really happy to be able to be at the forefront of this debate and help in navigating this disruption.
That's really encouraging to hear, and it's great to hear somebody talking about strategy really at the forefront, not just what's on an Excel spreadsheet driving decisions. So congratulations on that. Can you talk us through some of the differences between strategic foresight or futures studies and how most of us understand trend analysis or intelligence analysis? What are the distinctions?
Yeah, absolutely, Doug. And I think that's really an important question, because I think for probably most of us that are listening in today, we may have heard of strategic foresight or futures, but I think it's important to underscore the fact that there are many folks out there today who are sort of self-professed futurists without any real training or background to do so. And so it's important to underscore that the Air Force today not only has a strategic foresight and futures branch, but has academically trained folks that have been through some of the most rigorous training in the United States and internationally behind them, and able to look at these issues with that background and also leveraging their professional networks. And as I mentioned before, strategic foresight operates on the premise that the future as a singular entity doesn't exist. There are many possible futures. And so our job is essentially to develop alternative futures that expand the range of possibilities for strategic planning. And what we do is, we actually did this in the report. I'm going to step through these. Through looking at emerging issues. And so this is what we call an S-curve. It's one valuable tool that futurists use. And this is important because it does not only applies to geopolitics, but it also applies equally to technical issues. And if you look at where a particular issue falls along this trend line, right, towards we've got the bottom left-hand corner where we talk about the Foresight zone, more nascent emerging issues. That's really where we want to be looking now, to be able to take the weak signals and emerging trends, put them together, and then look at building scenarios. In many cases, we actually see established issues or trends being carted out as something quote unquote new or innovative when they've actually been written about or talked about for a while. And that is not strategic foresight. And there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding that. So I think the value that we bring in terms of looking at strategic planning for the Air Force and why we built these scenarios out and we used all of the different touch points that are in the report is that, number one, we want to provide a guidebook for how to actually do emerging issues analysis and where to identify your issue. You'd be surprised how many issues are misidentified and then have large budgets or assumptions behind them. And that actually can lead to, I think, some flawed assumptions in moving forward with strategic planning. In terms of the scenarios, we actually use a framework that was developed by Jim Dater, who is the founder of the Research Institute for Future Studies out at the University of Hawaii, which is a global leader in future studies. And we look at these are generic images of the future. And the reason why we pick these is because if we look throughout history, basically these are the kind of archetypes of outcomes that could happen. Is it going to be a continued growth scenario? Is it going to be a discipline scenario, a systemic collapse, or a systemic transformation? And the important part that we talk to Air Force leadership about is throughout each of these alternative future scenarios, this is really important, there are winners and losers. And the organizations that are best positioned to take advantage of whatever new order is going to emerge after disruption are the ones that actually can future-proof their strategic planning. And that's why our scenarios are so important. And so I think that's the real value proposition of this kind of report, but also applying this type of thinking. And this type of thinking really needs to become what I like to call an operating system. So we need to have this as part of our day-to-day operational culture. If we're waiting basically to create a smartphone app where you can just push a button and get an analysis like this, that's the wrong answer. And in the midst of disruption, what we see historically is that most organizations are either over-predicting largely or under-predicting the impact of change and disruption. And so through analyses like this and through leveraging our global network of practitioners to get some true diversity of opinion behind it, I think you're able to mitigate that. And I think you're just able to do strategic planning in a much more disciplined way to be able to examine the complexity behind what we're facing.
Yeah, those visuals really help too in understanding this, where you're going. So reading your report, it's clear that you've identified key sources of disruption that impact the Air Force and the Department of Defense. Can you talk about your methodology for building the scenarios and also explain to our audience what horizon scanning means?
Absolutely. So this is actually the fun part of doing all of this, right? And so once we were able to figure out, once we identified as a group what we had seen, and again, each one of our co-authors, as I showed you before, I had a specific section of the report that they were responsible for writing, and that's based off their own subject matter expertise and what they wanted to bring to the table and what we had asked. And so horizon scanning is actually doing just that. It's scanning, if you will, not only what's happening in the current environment, but through our own professional networks and through some exquisite data applications, qualitatively and quantitatively, weak signals that we see across a range of areas. What we do then is we take those weak signals and we put them together and we actually build a map. So you can actually you can walk through this process of basically visioning, foresight to strategy, where then as you go through this exercise, the horizon scanning becomes the building block of your actual scenario outputs. So what we were able to do through building the scenarios was basically engineer alternative futures to produce that desired effect, which was really to disrupt assumptions that we had in terms of our habits of thinking. But we wanted to also give scenarios that were value added to our leadership that seemed also plausible based off of the weak signals today. And we should mention that today's weak signals are tomorrow's reality. So it's critical to be able to identify those today and to use them, to harness them in a compelling way that actually makes, I think, a critical difference when we're talking about overlaying them in our strategic planning documents. And so, interpreting the scenario framework and what do they really represent, we built 4 overarching global scenarios And for the report, obviously, we centered the major source of disruption on the pandemic and everything surrounding it, and all of sort of the second and third order effects of COVID-19. And we built a scenario for each outcome that you've seen there: the continued growth, discipline, collapse, and transformation. Now, it's important to note that the scenarios also don't represent the most likely outcomes. What we did is we turned up the volume on those weak signals that we've been watching in a major way that might even seem improbable today, and then weaved them together into possible futures for a post-COVID world. And we think that this really creates this necessary feeling of reality, and it allows our audience, in this case, which was the senior leadership in both the Department, in the Department of the Air Force and Department of Defense. And now what we're seeing is becoming a much more international audience as well, as we're seeing a lot of questions coming from international media and as well as academia.
No, that is really interesting. So AFWIC is doing lots of work towards crafting what future of the Air Force should look like. Can you explain how strategic foresight helps the Air Force realize that goal?
Absolutely, Doug. So I think right directly to your point, this slide that I'm showing you here basically asks, I think, a question: disruption happens, and now what? And so what this report allows us to do, and what we can deliver for the Department of the Air Force, is to find opportunities despite the disruption, to leverage the unique capabilities that air power and the Air Force and the Space Force bring to the table. And so we are in this midst of a sudden disruptive shift. We've had some time to think about it now, but the question really is, where do we go from here? What do we do with that? How do we leverage some of the opportunities that are inherent in today's present crisis towards a beneficial outcome, ultimately for the United States of America, but using the unique talent, capabilities, and systems that are inherent in the Air Force? And so, where we are today is this going to be a continuation of the present? How are we going to manage this disruption? And how are we going to walk through? How do the scenarios that we built actually play to, I think, the traditional strengths of air power and the Air Force moving forward? And we actually look at that. So in each of our global scenarios, and I know we're going to talk about those in a bit, we actually examine, who are the winners and losers in those scenarios, and where does the Air Force as a department, where does the Department of the Air Force stand best poised to take advantage of the opportunities that are there? And I think that really is a unique approach that we've taken, that also highlights what the service can bring to the table and what it can offer.
So if you're going to execute another report, what additional topics should be high on your list to explore?
Well, that's a great question. And I do want to say for the audience that this is just the first of what are going to be many reports. And we're already working on a major project looking at future alliances and partnerships and how those all fit together. And because even if we look at a conceptual type issue like joint all-domain command and control, we see that all of these touch points mentioned in the report actually come back and relate to that. And we need to navigate the present disruption to find out how we can best harness the opportunities that are there to make that even a more viable and a more resilient program. And so what we would look at, I think, in the future would be also when we talk about things like automation and the balance of human-machine teaming that certainly is on the table, which is extremely important. We need to think critically about how we're going to do that. And so there's a general assumption that, based on technological advances, that now we'll have fewer humans doing jobs that we traditionally have in the Air Force or in the military. But I would argue that one of the things we need to really think thoroughly in a disciplined way about is actually, we certainly will automate processes, and we will automate certain functions that we currently have a heavy human capital labor effort on. The question is, in doing so, do we actually raise the premium on contextualized knowledge? Do we raise the premium on expertise in key areas? And I think the answer to that is yes. And so how are we looking at our human capital requirements to build not only what we're looking at as multi-domain airmen, but airmen that also can win the cognitive domain and that have those very, very honed and specialized skill sets, completely different requirements than we're going to have today. And so part of that also is the question, raises the broader issue of, what does the national security defense workforce look like tomorrow? how are we going to build a new national defense industrial base and sort of inculcating this technical way of thinking into the workforce, right? I mean, it's truly a paradigm shift. So we're going to be partnering with lots of our colleagues on the air staff, but also globally to tackle some of those really challenging issues and questions that I think would also lend themselves well to a report of this magnitude.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. So let's focus on one of your dedicated areas of work in the report, the 4 global scenarios for a post-COVID-19 world. You mentioned systemic collapse, continued growth, discipline, and transformation scenarios. Please give us a 60,000-foot summary of each of these vignettes, and what are some of the challenges as well as opportunities you've identified through these scenarios for the Air Force and DoD? And we're about halfway through our hour block here, so if we can hit wave tops a little bit, that'd be great.
Absolutely, Doug. So we'll just go through really quickly. We looked at, again, as I mentioned, each of those scenarios. And so in our global future, this is our systemic transformation. And so basically we looked at the weak signals and we looked at the emerging trends and we basically mapped the disruption. And so we developed the first future, which we're calling from bio-hegemony to bio-supremacy, where we take a look out to 2035 and we look at essentially the new great powers being those states that actually have achieved superior levels of bio-resiliency. And so in a transformation future, it's important to remember that this is addressing a fundamental shift in the rules of an established order. So here we're looking at states that can not only possess this bio-resiliency, but also the capability to make information ubiquitous across the entirety of their security apparatus. Those are the ones that dominate that new competition. In our second scenario, we look at a systemic collapse. And what we were calling this, again, is the collapse scenario we call the new warring states period, which really looks at, and our colleague Shannon McGurk is going to talk more about China in a bit, but basically, going back to the ancient Chinese conflict era, as well as what we're looking at as the outbreak of the 21st century's first continental scale civil war in China, based on a lot of weak signals and emerging trends that we're looking at today. And in collapse, right, the value of a collapse future scenario is to show us the possibility of the sudden loss of order, right? So these incomes are not necessarily good or bad. They're very subjective, right? Depending on where you sit on the fence of this issue, it could be good or it could be bad. But a lot of these depend on historical and contextual interpretations. But I think another key part that we identified in the collapse scenario affects, really, it cuts across the board, and it looks at legitimacy crisis, particularly around the truth narrative itself, right? Our populations no longer believing what governments are telling them, right? And this is really a dramatic shift that contributes to the global instability that we talk about in that collapse scenario. In the third scenario, this is the disciplined future. And this really, the disciplined future serves the purpose to show us that collapses are not necessarily complete or transformational. So for example, you can consider a disciplined future like the period during the Great Depression and through the Second World War, right, where we saw regulating of prices, freedom of movement even being regulated at times, and rationing of goods. So in 2035, we're looking at a lot of commonalities where liberal and authoritarian regimes actually moving towards these highly centralized and restrictive measures. And in particular, I think the takeaway from this one is that we're looking at national militaries and in particular national air forces augmenting commercial supply chains and even the oversight and production of local distribution of goods, right? So again, and we'll put the link up at the end of this where folks can actually dive in and read in more detail. I'm just stepping through these quickly, but the big takeaway there again for national air forces and militaries. And then in the fourth scenario, which is our continued growth, we look at essentially how different things could turn out if fundamental principles today do not change, right? And so we're calling this endemic disruption. And based on what we're dealing with today, we're looking at, in this scenario for 2035, states essentially maintaining data profiles of their populations, but more importantly, states that can maintain data profiles of their competitors' populations now have the ability to predict the intensity and timeline of each new outbreak. So now you basically have these windows of opportunity, what we're calling a rhythmic readiness, where states can actually determine the status of populations and armed forces of their competitors and how long they'll be vulnerable to attack. And so this rhythmic readiness can really create instability. But what we see in this scenario is actually a benefit, as the US Air Force benefited significantly, basically this new offset strategy to limit the reliance on troop levels and also less civilian air traffic. And we're seeing wide-scale proliferation of unmanned area vehicles, et cetera. So I think in this scenario, we look at it, again, how things could be if fundamental principles don't change and what the costs of inaction could be.
Yeah. So looking at all of that, if you had 3 top points you could brief to DoD leaders from this section of the report, what would they be?
Yeah, I would say number one, that we would address, I think, the criticality of this paradigm shift in thinking. Number one, understanding the sources of disruption, understanding that we need to truly disrupt how we perceive strategic planning through various lenses, and that it can't be a linear approach, that we really need to look at all of these touch points around a whole host of areas that impact our core mission area. But some takeaways additionally from the report, if we just look at what we've got on our slide here, this idea that we can't lose sight of these new emerging fault lines in critical areas of interest to the United States and our allies. Seeing things like, and some of our panelists are going to talk about this a bit later, but this idea that disinformation is not limited just to Russia, China, Iran, or violent extremists, but actually we're going to see likely a totality of these actors, either jointly or independently, simultaneously executing these complex, multifaceted influence campaigns. And these actually target global populations. So it gets back to that truth narrative that we talk about. And that's something that impacts our ability as a national military to operate, and impacts directly our national defense strategy as well. But also the fact that because of the disruption, the opportunity now for perhaps a shift in even accepting a bit more surveillance and automation in the name of public health, where we would see the Air Force actually being well poised to help with that in various roles, and not only technologically, but also applying some of our existing mission sets. And so, what are the challenges and opportunities there? I think we lay out those as in a very disciplined way. And I'm looking forward to hearing as well as we go through our panelists to dive a bit more into each of their sections. And again, I think if I could just close on one note to say that I think the power behind this, Doug, really is that not only was the service driving this effort, but the fact that we truly were able to harness this global network of practitioners and partners who were able to bring their expertise, and just made this a much, much more, I think, sophisticated and compelling report that allows us to really have this great thought exercise.
Yeah. No, and like you said, Jake, when it was back in January or December, so many of these things would have seemed very far-flung and almost sci-fi-ish. And yet you look at where we sit today, you can really see the value of thinking about the unexpected and where it might take us and how we should respond. So I really appreciate you going through all of that. If we get all the other panelists back up on camera, we're going to do more of the roundtable format here, and appreciate everybody sitting through the initial presentation. Let's start first with the space scenario. Kara, you executed a section looking at future competition in space. Can you please walk us through your scenarios?
Sure. I thought actually, just because of time, I would kind of wrap up the key findings across scenarios,
Sure.
which I think is much more valuable. So, some of the key takeaways and some of the horizon scanning that we did that fed into each of our divergent scenarios for space really was kind of focused on, the pre-COVID period, and then the kind of what we're seeing as early indicators going into the pandemic, and then looking beyond. So there were some really interesting things that were already happening in space. It's a really exciting time. The commercial sector is booming. There's a lot of activity, a lot of promise and optimism. We have seen obviously a couple of shakeouts, with OneWeb, but they're making a recovery there. Bigelow Aerospace also went bankrupt. But in general, I mean, we're still humming along. There's a lot of activity still going along. We're continuing to push forward in P-LEO constellations and on-orbit manufacturing, and we have plans to go to the moon and Mars. We just recently launched humans back to the space station with SpaceX's rocket. So there's been a lot of great advancements that are still happening. However, we've also seen kind of a really big disruption in supply chain. And I think, one of the key takeaways from the report is, there's a lot of, strengths and weaknesses, but, supply chain, I think, across the board, and you'll hear that kind of later on, it's a major weakness. And actually, the Air Force just signed on Black Sky to do some Earth observation analysis related to supply chain issues for the Air Force. So that's a really interesting kind of way that space is being used, right, to kind of monitor what's happening in a post-pandemic world. There also were some interesting things happening that were kind of unexpected in the sense that space was used to observe how the world is changing because of, people's behavior shifts due to the pandemic, right? We weren't commuting as much. There were major pollution decreases, right? Wildlife was having different patterns just because humans were staying at home. We weren't consuming as much. And that really, I think, was a great opportunity for us to collect data, to understand, to ask questions about what if we could do things differently societally and as a whole. So it's very interesting, right? A big part of this effort is really focused on, well, what's happening in our geopolitical realm with space, but there's all these like underlying rich factors that kind of feed into how is space adding value to understanding the shifting landscape, but also how is space itself kind of a key player in this geopolitical clash between what's happening. And so I think another big takeaway is, like, no matter what scenarios we were looking at, is that, the competitive advantage and how you calculate it is really a whole of problem. We can't just look at, little snippets of capability. We really have to look at all the way from, the strategy and the doctrine to the technical capability to the execution. And that really is, I think, one of the values that foresighting brings to the table, is it really does look across that broad landscape that Jake had talked about. The adversary in our competition, they don't care about any of the reorgs that are going on. Obviously, space on the government side is in major flux with the stand up of the Space Force. But they don't really care about the infighting. They don't care about the rice bowls. They don't care about the titles that are associated, with these new positions and how, authorities are getting reallocated. They're looking at this time to leapfrog and to get ahead and to push towards their preferred futures. And there are some very critical windows of opportunity, not just in space, but particularly in space right now, that are going to determine how we lead and if we lead in the next 10 to 20 years. So there is an urgency to act now, and I think we need to be really cognizant and vigilant about what actions that we're taking, to make sure that we're going to maintain that advantage. And again, across all the scenarios, one of the other key takeaways was, the speed and agility, our technical prowess, and our strategic readiness is going to be tested. And what we decide to do, again, leveraging foresight, if we are able to be more proactive about the kinds of activities we engage in now, to be prepared, to push ahead, to have a vision, we're going to be much more well-positioned than if we just sit back and stay in a reactive mode. So I think, in summary, I look at the pandemic as kind of a call to wake up. I mean, we were already kind of going down this route. A pandemic is a one-off event, and who knows, next time, this time next year, if we're even going to be talking about it. I'm sure we'll be remembering this moment in our lives forever. But I think it's a really important, and in some ways it's a gift for us to really reevaluate what we're doing and to build that vision, to build the vision for what we want as a nation, to build it for what we want in space, to build that critical infrastructure that we need for sustainable human presence in space and promoting leadership and prosperity, that all of us can kind of be part of it. So that's kind of the key takeaways is like, going back to what Jake was saying earlier, the specific futures we have, they're not supposed to be taken verbatim. The real value is looking across the futures and trying to figure out, how do I hedge my bets? How do I deliver capability? And how do I push forward to leadership no matter what happens across futures?
No, and I really appreciate you going through that and the depth of that. And I think it strikes at the point too, and Jake brought this up earlier, where everybody thinks, gee, we're in the pandemic, the budgets are getting shredded, what are we going to cut? And in many ways, it should be, where do we need to double down? Because what is the cost of not doing that? And we're seeing that time and time again as we go through this crisis, where the cost of being unprepared is just catastrophic. And so I really hope leaders focus on that as we chart the forward course. We've lost Jason here on the connection, so we're going to skip ahead to Vera. And I understand you focused on malign influence campaigns. Could you please walk us through your findings and considerations? This is clearly a major topic that has extreme implications for national security in ways we could not have imagined in decades past.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. Okay, so let me kind of walk you through sort of broad findings and recommendations really in what we're looking at. I mean, look, before the pandemic, we have been dealing with broad malign influence and disinformation, misinformation, really arguably for decades, right? From all host of actors, depending on who you're focusing on, whether you're looking at Russia and how it has spread its malign influence and disinformation being a part of it, in not just, obviously we had, the election, our election, but also in the near abroad and in former Soviet Union states in Europe and other parts of the world, whether you're talking about China or whether you're talking about violent extremist organizations. I mean, none of this is really new, but what I really wanted to focus on in the report is that what we're now seeing in that in light of the pandemic and because of the sort of source of instability that's happening, you're really starting to see this convergence of actors really pushing disinformation as part of a broader malign influence toolkit. And when I say that, so I'll talk about that in a couple of ways. For first of all, malign influence is not just disinformation. When we talk about just first of all disinformation, it is having that strategic intent to spread false narratives, or even, if you will, in conspiracy theories or half-truths, if you will, right? And where you also have folks that are really living in their filter bubbles, or misinformation, sort of the benign, if you will, that you and me and anyone else that, can spread information without really thinking critically, corroborating the sources of data. But broad and malign influence strategy, we're talking about, yes, it's disinformation, but it's also opaque media ownership, it's business interests, right? It is the ability to use culture and history as part of to influence targeted populations, to use the strategic objectives of a country, a nation state or a non-state actor to influence society, to influence democratic norms, principles in the population. So that's that. So what we're now seeing with in the pandemic, and where I really feel like what's really on the horizon in the future, and why this is really important in the post-COVID world when we think about the geostrategic competition, it's really this convergence that I know Jake talked about, and I wrote in the report. And so, look, we've had Russia, and then Russia has been spreading both broad as part of their broader malign influence strategy, both disinformation and information campaigns. It's everything from creating original content. I mean, we can go back to even earlier days to amplifying on social media, right? Different types of content that's not coming from St. Petersburg, Russia, but it's actually originating here in America by Americans, right? Because, you also have the situation where, and this has been true with the COVID, and I think this is sort of where we're kind of moving towards in the future, where people don't know what to believe. People are not checking their facts. People are just posting whatever they need to post online, and people are themselves, organizations, given what your interests are spewing conspiracy theories and these half-truths. So oftentimes, a state actor, for example, or a non-state actor, so Russia in this example, all they have to do is they don't have to create original content; they can just amplify it. And so again, that is a tactic, and that's part of the strategy. We're also seeing it. This potentially, can be a trend going in the future, that China is also using some of that, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is using some of that toolkit from Kremlin as well. And then it's also about, what works, what sticks. We now also have, I should say, we've talked about ISIS in the past, but QAnon, right? Like sort of the other fringe movements on social media as well. The reason why disinformation, malign influence campaigns is so dangerous, we're already seeing tidbits of this, and I think in the post-COVID world, where we're still seeing, so much, kind of like instability, this geostrategic competition, how this is going to affect global movements and the flow of information, because it's not only that it's on social media, and it's not only on that it's on print or on TV, but it also has the ability to proliferate offline. And that's the critical piece. And the potential to cause real world harm. They can be harassment or literally physical harm, whether, you could talk about whether it's, small scale attacks or large scale attacks or anything, or protests, anything, right? So that's where the direction is headed. And those are sort of the trends and the triggers that we have to pay attention going forward. And it's really the convergence of actors where they're really playing off. And so, I talked about in the report, there's a couple of key scenarios, right? First and foremost, when you think about a geostrategic competition across the world, the information environment is rapidly changing. And what we've seen with COVID, now we have this whole thing, the infodemic, right? So the misinformation that's surrounding the pandemic, it arguably is spreading faster than the actual pandemic itself. Hard to imagine, given where we are in the pandemic, just the United States alone, right? But it's spreading faster. So the information environment, I say that because the information environment is changing. So we need to be thinking about, in the future, when we think about geostrategic competition and how malign actors, whether state or non-state actors, will exploit the information environment, we need to look at the changes in the information environment. And part of that is, what are the actual vulnerabilities? And when I say vulnerabilities, folks, that's sources of instability in the information environment that make it particularly ripe for a nation state or a non-state actor to manipulate and penetrate. So it's everything from, again, weak media institutions, right? We have journalists who have, in various parts of the world, have poor literacy skills, who don't know, who are trained, and I think, U.S. government and other partner institutions, implementing partners, invest significantly in training journalists and strengthening that media environment, right? But also, we have opaque media ownership, where you have, if you will, opaque business interests, if you will, right, who are controlling the media. So all of that's correlated, and that creates the vulnerabilities in the environment. Because if you think about it, if you have a weak operating environment, that's when an adversary can go and just poke, right? It literally will just poke into the environment to see where it can explode. So,
Yes.
So in the future, just real quickly, we need to be focusing on that. I think the other thing, we really need to be thinking about how the actors will shape their tactics and the dynamics. And arguably the most important, I'll leave it with this, is that what role does technology actually play? Because in this case, technology, not just platforms and social media, but technologies that are actually creating counter disinformation tools, both can create in terms of challenges and opportunities. And I'll leave it at that.
No, I appreciate that. And when you think about national security, depending so much on developing a consensus in a populace, you can really see the challenges that this is going to unleash as this develops. Shannon, let's go to you next. When it comes to your topic and China's Belt and Road Initiative, I would imagine that COVID-19 has unleashed a myriad of dynamics that would be extremely impactful to this program. Can you please explain how your futures work in the subject area dealt with the topic?
Absolutely. First, I want to say thank you for inviting us, and I want to thank Lt Col Sotiriadis for this opportunity. I have a bottom line answer, but then I'd like to also make 3 points, if I may. The bottom line answer is what C-19 has done for the world, really, is it's revealed the players for who they are, right? It's like a Shakespearean drama where now you see everybody for exactly who they are. Mm-hmm. In a practical sense, there are 3 things I'd like to say about that regarding China. The first thing to remember is that China is a culture, not a country. So we must always think in terms of transnationally because China thinks in global terms. The second thing is the Chinese Communist Party sees itself as the leader of all of the Chinese culture, all the Chinese civilization, but the Chinese Communist Party, as its name states, is ideological. So first and foremost, they're ideologues. And it means that their leaders are in the grip of that ideology. So everything we look at with regard to what China does, and futurism really liberates us to do this objectively, is we must remember that they're in the grip of an ideology on a global scale. And then the third point I'd like to make is that the Chinese Communist Party has seen the United States as an existential threat since at least 1996. And some people in the China community would argue since 1949. So we frequently ask ourselves the question, and I think One Belt, One Road is revealing all of this. We used to ask ourselves the question, is China the enemy of the United States? The more practical question to ask, and futurist studies have allowed us to answer this question. The better question to ask is, does China see us as a threat? And I think their actions reveal that they do. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's very insightful.
Okay, and C-19 has revealed this, because we see through debt diplomacy, we see through the reactions of those member nations who have been pulled into One Belt, One Road, that in point of fact, I think if all things were equal, they would prefer to work with the United States. So this is an opportunity for us to engage. But I hope I answered your question.
No, that's really useful, and I particularly like how you emphasize the notion that it's not just how we view the world, it's how the world views us, and we need to be very careful about not projecting our values and assuming people are on that same page. So, Jason,
well,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yep.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. No, please continue.
No, we've just got Jason back in the line here, and we're getting tight on time, so I just wanted to jump over to him fast. And Jason, you focused on supply chains and national security, and wanted to just give you a quick opportunity if you could give us, 3 minutes, your top takeaways.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important fact here is that the stress we've already seen probably is likely to accelerate, right? In order to get some sort of improvement of relations with China regarding trade, we'd have to have certain expectations that there would be a significant improvement in relations and that we wouldn't need bifurcated future supply chains. So, as the scenarios I played out, right, I mean, there's, I think, two levels to think about it. And one is, Jake kind of talked about, a lot of folks assume the trend will continue. And whenever you give people an option, more or less the same, they're usually going to pick up at the same. But the world I live in, and I have to make forecasts for a living, and my clients say, well, not only what are the scenarios, but what do you think the most likely is? For me, I'm often looking for where the second derivative dynamic is. In other words, where is there going to be an acceleration or a deceleration in terms of pain points? And so for me, the trade dynamics we had before COVID-19 really pressure cookered it and presented, in my view, the opportunity for the tensions to accelerate. Now, how quickly they accelerate is another question, but it did not appear to me to be something that could make it better. Now, there are opportunities things can get better, and there are a couple scenarios I have for that. But, as we look at the potential outcomes, it's important to consider things that right now seem unlikely because, to Jake's point, right, how many of us predicted this back on New Year's Eve? And the answer is none of us, right? So if none of us predicted this, we have to be at least putting out there what those scenarios might be that right now, from all angles, seem extremely unreasonable and unlikely, as well as a discussion of what if things continue, and that most important second derivative kind of change, right? COVID-19 is more of a massive step change up, but a lot of what happens doesn't happen at the same pace and doesn't remain constant. Even that rate of change doesn't remain constant. So when I'm looking at the future, I'm looking at where do I see that transition up the S-curve? Where do we see the beginning of an increasing second derivative of opportunity or of tension? And when we think about supply chain, right, there's a few different critical pain points. There's the PPE point, there's the technology point. That's already been out there. That's been going on for a few years. I think one of the most important things that's happened in the recent years, in 2016, when China was a main talking point, the last presidential election, that was lampooned a bit, right? But now it's a bipartisan issue that people recognize as something we actually need to be paying a lot of attention to. That's been a big shift in just 3.5 years. So I think as we look forward, we need to prepare for those outside cases, but where the shift in a little bit more, a little bit quickly, or a little bit lower. And as we look forward for supply chain, we are symbiotically, economically linked with China in many ways. Decoupling, that's going to be very difficult, but the technology ecosystem that China has that rivals some of what's going on in the US, some of that because of technology transfers, some of that because of espionage and stealing our tech and the whole thing. If we want to disrupt that ecosystem, if that is now a bipartisan issue and a national security issue, then the idea that we're going to end up in a kumbaya supply chain situation seems wildly unlikely. And then it's really the other scenarios and how drastic do they play out as proxy wars in countries like India or in other critical economies that are China adjacent, like they did in the Cold War with the Soviet Union? Or is it just we have these punctuations of more tension, less tension? Or, you know, do we see things kind of simmer off a little bit? Those are the ways that at least I looked at these questions, but I think supply chain, moving around physical stuff, has become something that like little kids and grannies now know about. And yet 5 years ago in business schools, 10 years ago in business schools, people didn't even know what supply chain was, but everyone knows what it is because honestly, the entire economy and society was on a razor's edge of supply chain with COVID-19. And if we hadn't managed to get people the food and the stuff that all of us have probably delivered to our homes, society could have really, the wheels could have fallen off in a more dramatic way than we already see the tensions in place, both domestically and globally.
No, that's a really great answer, and I appreciate that. And it's really interesting, the notion that the last time we faced such massive security challenges around the globe, we really owned our supply chain domestically. And yet now that's a radically different set of circumstances, so it really highlights the importance of the work you're doing. Well, I really appreciate all your time and being with us here today. We've come to the end of this segment for our discussion. I'd like to thank you all for your insightful comments and for sharing your perspective on the critical issues. As an alert to our listeners, our next event is tomorrow when the Mitchell Institute will host Delon Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council for Nuclear Deterrence Forum. The time for this has changed from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., so just heads up on that. So thank you very much. Now, we're going to open the session to questions from the audience, and I've got two here in our Q&A feature. And as a reminder to our listeners, you can participate in the Q&A by using the raise hand function on your device. When I call on you, please unmute your mic and state your name and affiliation for our guest before asking a question. You can also submit a question in writing using the Q&A function, in which case I'll read the question aloud to the team. With that, let's do our Q&A ones first. The first one I've got here is, who do you envision as the primary consumers of the AFWIC Global Futures Report? For instance, is it policymakers, combatant commanders, operators?
Yeah, Doug,
open to any of you. Yep.
I would say that, you know, the intendee, and it's a great question because it speaks to sort of the rationale for writing the report as well. And the intended audience really was the senior leadership of the Department of the Air Force and the Department of Defense. But to be honest, it's really for anybody, I think, that's, you know, concerned about national security futures, and that can be really across a whole range of levels. Yeah. I think that's the beauty of this product, and I really think that's the secret behind the interest that's driving it. Is that, you know, while it does have, I think, some conclusions that are hard hitting and that apply at a strategic level, I think no matter where one is, sort of in the range of activities. You know, there's something in there for everybody, and you know, the range of topics and the way I think what helps is, you know, by being able to explain very succinctly how future studies, how strategic foresight can really impact, you know, any organization's day-to-day operations, and how it's such a critical aspect of doing any type of strategic planning. I think that allows you to go from the national strategic level, you know, all the way down to the individual level. And there's something in there that impacts everybody. And I think that really is part of the power behind the report.
That's a great answer. Got another question here on Q&A. Can you explain a little bit more about your process for cultivating the list of potential disruptors? How far back along the maturity curve are you reaching? Are you starting with science fiction ideas, or are you looking more to mature trends that might be found in the media?
I'd like to address that if I may.
Yep.
I'm sorry I don't have my notes with me right now, but I responded to that message briefly in text. With regard to the People's Republic of China, and I make a distinction between the People's Republic of China, the Republic of China, and China, right? With the CCP in charge in the People's Republic of China, if there's no such thing as a private citizen. So if a science fiction writer is writing books that are promoted throughout the People's Republic of China, it is essential to look at those writers, because the messages that they're putting out are de facto endorsed messages from the Chinese Communist Party leadership. And I know in the project that Lt Col Sotiriadis is quarterbacking right now, I'm very excited about our use of science fiction writers in China. That's my short answer. Yeah, I think it's vital.
No, it's really interesting. Anybody else on that one?
I guess I'll just weigh in real quickly. It's really, I think as Jake kind of alluded to before, full up foresighting really is about the push and pull of the future. So you need a bottoms up horizon scanning method where you're quantitatively and qualitatively looking at data. But you also need to have a farther out future. For this particular report, because we were so focused on the pandemic, and that in itself is kind of a shock to many of our readers. And we're still in shock, I think, about what's actually happening in the secondary and tertiary effects that we're having ongoing. We didn't really do as much, digging on the impossible, because honestly, what is happening now, like we had mentioned 6 months ago, we never would have thought was possible. But in other types of work, I think it's really important to have a strong balance between the push and the pull of the future. So, do your horizon scanning, look at those early disruptors, but also think about where you want to go, what are your preferred futures, what are not your preferred futures, and work your way backwards that way as well.
That's good. Got Garrett Ream as his hand raised. Garrett?
Yes, I was more curious about some of the practical impacts of your work, and I wonder, has your work on this report or any of your recent conversations changed any of the requirements on aircraft or subsystems? I wonder if subsystems have been expanded to account for potential future scenarios.
So let me just address that briefly, and then we can also allow some of our other co-panelists to discuss it as well. I think at a very broad level, the answer to that is yes, but maybe in a different way than we would expect traditionally, to think about that issue. I think the value of the report and what strategic foresight can bring, and if we want to look at air power futures, right, as a separate category, and Air Force futures, again, it's looking at a characterization of the strategic environment, and then also harnessing that STEEP framework of looking at developments across the scientific, technological, economic, environmental, and political, and then seeing how we would map out the weak signals and emerging trends, in all of those processes, to then come back to not only, I think what you talked about, which is different types of aircraft and future design thinking, but also everything that goes back to that landscape analogy that I gave you. And so it's also the concepts, it's the conceptual diagrams for how those systems would be employed. So not necessarily just the acquisition of new platforms, but also what does that networked architecture look like that also enables those platforms to function? And then also what adversaries and allies and partners are going to do about those types of systems and developments. So I think what the scenarios in the report does in a practical way is allows you to, I think, take the document and sort of overlay the findings and overlay each individual section. If you notice, the way we had written it deliberately was that each section that each of these co-authors had written has 4 scenarios as well, so you can get a deeper dive into a particular subject area. And I think the value of it is to take the conclusions from that, or even not necessarily conclusions, but to take some of the emerging trends that we've looked at in weak signals, and then compare that to some of the baseline assumptions that we have in terms of acquisition of new systems and also employment of current systems. And I think it allows us to enhance the possibilities, the range of possibilities, and also how we define our preferred futures.
Anybody else on that one? Okay, got a question here from Teresa Hitchens. What would you like to see emanating from this report? In other words, what should leaders do to be flexible to be able to weather these possible changes?
I'd like to take a stab at the aspect of this. I mean, like, I think, futures, like as already been discussed, future scenario development and futures is really designed to actually think about also how do you do strategic and operational planning? What things do you need to have in place to prevent potential scenarios and catastrophes? What I also hope is that we're also going to see broader collaboration and integration across the board. And I look at it again, of course, through my lens, not just within Air Force, DOD, and then even broader U.S. government and interagency, but part of a lot of these solutions when we think about competition post-COVID, geostrategic competition, it requires a whole of society approach where you have to take out DOD, put it in the interagency construct, but also think through how do you actually work with technology companies, right? How do you work with civil society and so on? So I think there's this broader application when in that whole society approach when we're thinking about designing strategic planning and operational planning.
Got a question here from Frank Wolf. Frank?
Yeah, hi. Just in terms of the supply chain disruptions, that was obviously an interesting part of the report. And I just wondered the current risk right now you see to the Air Force, and then just in terms of how the Black Sky small satellite contract by AFWIC recently and other efforts are contributing to any kind of alleviation of those possible disruptions.
Yeah, so I think that, as we look at the supply chain, it's not just about securing supply chains for material. It's not just about securing rare earth metals or securing PPE. It's actually about, and I think part of this is fundamentally the US and China in this great power competition are coming head to head on everything technological, and that China has built up a significant technology ecosystem, and that part of the disruption is forcing technology companies either to get out of China or create a separate supply chain that serves the United States and China in order to make sure that you have essentially siloed production. I think that there have been already signs of this, more than weak signals. To Jake's point, or to what we look in the curve here, we've already got signals that that's a priority. Going forward, those will probably be bigger priorities. And for technology companies watching this, they have already started moving production facilities out of mainland China. Some have moved to Taiwan, some have moved to China adjacent countries. But on a 5, 10, 15, 20-year horizon, the number of countries you can move to right now before you need to move again is actually a pretty short list, especially if we consider proxy war risks. So, I think there are things that are being done to disrupt that ecosystem, as well as secure the supply chains of critical Air Force material, as well as other parts of the U.S. economy that are going to be more critical, right? PPE, all that medical device stuff, biologics, all that stuff's going to be shored up probably in a very bipartisan way after what's happening COVID-19. But we're going to see this spread to other parts of the economy to make the U.S. a bit less reliant on China, because that relationship's untenable if we're actually going to be in a continued great power competition struggle that could heat up at times.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just weigh in from the Black Sky piece of it. So, Black Sky has a bunch of LEO satellites that do remote sensing that the Air Force recently brought on to monitor their supply chain. And, in some regard, I'm really excited because I think that shows, a use case for another great use case for the commercial sector to help on this hard problem. But, on the flip side, I think going back to what Jason was saying, it really shows our short-sighted, approach on handling, supply chain. And now we're in reaction mode, just trying to scramble to collect data just to understand what's actually happening. And this really should be a broader wake-up call for what happens when the next disruption, occurs. Are we going to be better prepared then, or are we just going to kind of piecemeal it and only focus on, the COVID-related supply chain? And so I think it's really important for us, again, to use this time as a wake-up call.
Well, I'm sorry, but that's interesting. I mean, what would you say in terms of a wake-up call? What what should they, I mean, what should companies do differently? I mean, you've already sort of talked about moving out of mainland China, but what are some of the things you think that companies can do? Or
well, I mean, I think Jason's probably better. No, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah,
yeah, that's it. You know, I think what's going to happen, and we've been advising companies over the past year on this topic, because there was a question of, well, the tariffs and the trade war and that whole thing, wouldn't that just go away? And our opinion was no, because the great power competition isn't going away. And, you know, as they look at this, what companies are having to do, and there were a lot of companies that manufacture goods that were looking about moving out of China for a financial benefit in the face of tariffs. But high-tech companies are looking at either moving production out or essentially creating a duplicate siloed supply chain that is prepared only to serve the U.S. market, that is insulated from any supply chain to serve the Chinese market. In other words, they almost have to have a duplication of supply chains if they want to be able to serve those two markets. And that's what companies are doing. They're either moving stuff out, or they're essentially setting up two different supply chains to serve two different customers who will probably be for a long time in some level of conflict with each other.
Thanks.
No, I appreciate everybody's time in this. I'll just slip in one last one that was texted into us, and Jake, I think you can answer this. It was just a quick question. Are you guys working with OSD net assessment at all with your efforts?
Thanks, Doug. So the answer is that we are actually working with a large group of partners throughout the department and external to the department. And if I can just briefly mention, I think, you know, part of the success story here is, you know, harnessing this network, this really diverse network, ranging, you know, just from this report all the way from Hawaii to Egypt in putting this together. And so certainly, you know, the Office of Net Assessment is doing a phenomenal work. And certainly as we look at, you know, wargaming applications that come out of this report and other kinds of broad strategic analysis, you know, they're definitely a, you know, key partner. But I would also add that already we've had multiple universities, for example, the Stern School of Business at NYU actually has run a case study on strategic foresight and futures branch. And we've just started a 9-week partnership with National Intelligence University, where each one of these authors, each one of these panelists is going to be giving a seminar on their respective section of the report. And so I think it all ties back into what I said at the outstart of our talk, which is that we are living, I think, a renaissance of strategic foresight here and a rooted interest. And I think that what we would ultimately look as our strategic goal here for our branch and for the Air Force is really to look at the creation of an office of strategic foresight for the Air Force. And I think that it's so critical, you know, you bring up the net assessment example. It's critical that we have this capability in AFWIC, in the A5, that specifically is looking at how all of these issues that we talked about, these wide-ranging issues impact the Department of the Air Force, and how we're able to impact strategic planning. I think that's really powerful, and that's a model that we want not only to replicate, but we want to also build out and enhance moving forward.
That's great, Jake. I appreciate it. Well, we've come to the end of this Aerospace Nation event. And thanks again to Jake, Jason, Kara, Vera, and Shannon. And to you and our audience, from all of us here at Mitchell Institute, have a great aerospace power kind of day. Thanks, everybody.